Hello again, everyone, and welcome to one last bastion of scientific analysis and technical reporting, if you will. And I'd be very careful, again, as always on certain platforms, to only quote government and peer-reviewed and published data. So these days, once you stick ruthlessly to that rule, the censorship is not quite so bad. But nonetheless, the data I will show you is still quite shocking and revelatory. So this short special is on Sweden particularly, and generally on mortality from the viral issue. And we're going to be talking about some essentially scientific proofs of effectiveness of certain measures. So this one's a real keeper, and the link's down below to download it, and please do share so people understand better the actual data and the actual inferences that you can draw from it. So with that, let's get into it. It's important that we follow the scientific method, so I'll start with Professor Karl Popper, and his famous asymmetry of proof is an absolute joy to any real problem solver or real scientist. And simply put, if you find evidence that is against a hypothesis, like against lockdown or mask effectiveness, it is supremely powerful and vastly outweighs even a huge number of pieces of evidence that seem to support the hypothesis, like correlations. And it's the black swan principle. If you find an instance that clearly conflicts with hypothesis, it stands supreme. And Sweden is that example, although we have myriad more, and we have 100 published papers now and analyses that show that the hypothesis that lockdown and masks achieved something significant is a false hypothesis. So this recent article in Mainstream in the Nordics is interesting, and it triggered me to do this video. And converted into English, it's Tegnell's victory. Sweden fared as well as the rest of the Nordics during the pandemic in terms of life expectancy. And I won't read any more of it, but it basically says what we now know without question. So there's other Mainstream articles out on this now, and the Telegraph in London, and many, many others, the Spectator. So we now know that it's gone mainstream, that lockdown ineffectiveness was a disaster. So it's very safe to talk about it now and not be censored. This from the Daily Skeptic, though, was a beautiful article, and it was 8th of November, and they used published mortality data from the OECD countries. Sweden wins, and that's the point of this short video. So we can see here in black are the mortality excesses across all of the countries, and you know there's a huge variation over the whole pandemic period. But what's this country up here with the lowest excess mortality of all? You guessed it, it's Sweden, the supreme winner. And in red, it's the COVID badge deaths with positive PCR, so it's more noisy and all over the place. And that's because we know that the PCR badging of deaths just creates a noise fest. It's data that really is not even usable. So Professor Johan Giesecke, hope I pronounced that correctly, is the big guy in Sweden behind Tegnell. And he said early on mainstream television interviews, the Swedish government decided early in January that the measures we should take against the pandemic should be evidence-based. That's very important. And when you start looking around at the measures being taken by different countries, you find very few of them have a shred of evidence base. Well, I'll say. He went on to say, I think that the difference between countries will be quite small in the end. I don't think you can stop it. It's spreading. It will roll over Europe no matter what you do. And of course, he was absolutely correct. He just wasn't aware of seasonality yet, which explained everything else. Dr. Anders Tegnell himself, hero of science. Well, I think the question is, what data does the rest of the world base their decisions on? I think that's just as relevant, and we've been looking around, and there's very few things around that. There is this report from Imperial College, and it is a non-peer-reviewed report, and he was absolutely correct. It turned out to be absolute junk science. That's one of the few things you can find, the Imperial report, and in most countries you find nothing, because there was nothing. It came from China CCP policy that claimed to affect the curve with lockdown. But there was no evidence at the start, and now we know there never was any. So the WHO got a bit of a panic in April 2020, and they kind of felt they had to laud Sweden as a model for countries going forward, because they realised they were doing it correctly, and they thought they better get in the record. Now later the WHO went completely pharma insane, but interesting that the New York Post covered that they were getting on the record acknowledging Sweden were correct early on, and then they kind of forgot about that later. So, Sweden, why was it different than the Nordics? Well, one of the big reasons in 2020 that it was a little different from the Nordics was they have a pretty standard annual death rate, but you'll notice 2019 was very soft, unlike the Nordics. So, that displacement of mortality when COVID hit in 2020 caused a significant bump. But this is an artefact. This has nothing to do with their measures, of course. And we showed the imperial modelling at the time was absurd. It showed for varying degrees of measures taken in Sweden. This would be the death rate in the summer of 2020. And the blue curve shows what actually happened. And these are PCR badge deaths, so it was actually lower than this. And here's another example. The green line is what happened, cumulative mortality. And here was the modelling based on imperial done in Sweden for all different levels of measures. But it was all junk science. Here's from our movie, covidchroniclesmovie.com. You can get it for free. And it shows that modelling again from Sweden based on imperial kind of equations, what would happen, and the actual excess mortality in the period of 2020, the wave, is here. It was a few thousand. So, junk science across the board from Ferguson et al. And I've showed this back in April 2020, actually May 2020. It shows the April peak spike of PCR badged COVID deaths. And you can see it doesn't compare unfavourably with prior flu epidemics or seasons over the prior 20 years. There it is. And this is from the Swedish Statistics Government Database. There's the reference. Johan Hellström pulled it together. So again, can't be censored because it's actual government data. Spanish flu was obviously vastly higher. You're allowed to say that. And because Spanish flu hit people in their 30s as a median, it had vastly bigger spike in years of life lost. That would go around 10 screens high if you truly compared it in life years lost against this fella here. And the more recent data here from OS put it together for me in detail, and we see 2019 to 20 season, Sweden indeed had a higher mortality, and we explained that because of the soft 19 dynamics. But what about 2021 for Sweden compared against the Nordics and excess mortality? What happened? Oh, now there's no real excess. Norway's kind of pretty low. But importantly, 21 to 22, because it's a 2-year multiple season roll-up that you need to look at with novel members of a virus family that come along and cause an impact. Well, here you are. And if you roll it all up, you are better off being Sweden, as we showed you earlier. Oxford University, I'm going to throw this in from my archive, 9th of April 2020. And they basically said, we have a new estimate already in April of Ivor between 0.1 and 0.36. Turned out to be around 0.15. And they said that if younger populations are in a country like Ireland, the Ivor will be lower. And of course, Ireland hardly got touched because it has a young demographic. They also said in those without pre-existing health conditions and over 70 even, the data suggests the Ivor will likely not exceed 1%. Well, it was lower than that for over 70s without health conditions. Mortality in children seems to be near zero, unlike flu, which is also reassuring and will act to drive down the Ivor significantly. Imagine Oxford University, 9th of April 2020, which was proven out. Mortality in children seems to be near zero, unlike flu. And the Irish excellent government data shows under 25 around 1.5 million risk for under 25 group, and that's badged with PCR, and that includes with severe comorbidities. If you take that out, it's effectively zero. And from Ireland, April 22nd, just to make you laugh or cry, I'm not sure. Here's the government.ie data on Tuesday, 21st of April, when the wave was ending. 44 new deaths, median age was 87, 33 people had underlying health conditions. Actually, you'd find that all of them did, and this was typical for the daily updates. This represented COVID. And other Irish corona news, April 22nd, 2020, they were telling nursing home staff don't wear face masks unless there's an actual outbreak, in which case it'd be way too late. 22nd of April 2020. So just look at the madness that was going on, and now we know it was all crazy. Irish Times, of course, they were banning gatherings of healthy young people, meaningless madness, at the same time that they were telling them not to wear face masks, don't bother, in nursing homes unless it's actually already outbroken, in which case it's too late. So this is the reality of what was going on. So we'll remind you at the end, Sweden is the winner in mortality, in keeping their excess mortality the lowest of all countries, with no lockdowns, no masks, and kids up to 16 in school. And for those who say that Sweden kind of did a lockdown, watch this video from CNN from early May 2020, and this captures the reality in Sweden.
Visit Sweden now is to enter a strange land where people can just hang out together, seek shelter from the cold in cozy restaurants, go for a drink or a coffee.
It's been crowded all over, all the bars and restaurants and so on.
You can shop for fashion and beauty products, or even allow a hairdresser to invade your personal space.
Sooner or later I will get corona, I think, so.
That sums up the authorities' approach here. COVID-19 is going to be around for a while, and society must find a way to live with it. So, no forced lockdown. Instead, an emphasis on personal responsibility. Please work from home, keep to yourself in public. The official rule in bars and restaurants is stay an arm's length apart. Elementary and middle schools are still open. Anders Tegnell is the state epidemiologist driving the policies here. He claims success in flattening the curve and keeping serious cases within hospital capacity. Sweden's experience will inform governments around the world as they plot their exits from lockdown. But authorities here say it's still too soon to judge their actions because they, like everyone, are struggling to deal with a threat they're only starting to understand.
So there you have it, folks. There's the video from CNN and all my friends and network associates in Sweden, and I was there twice in the last 2 years. No masks anywhere, and the measures were kind of non-existent except for, look, stay at home, work at home if you can. Just reasonable personal responsibility stuff. So, Karl Popper, very important to remember, a black swan of the magnitude of Sweden is a closer. It's a case closer. And as I mentioned before, we have over 100 published papers and analyses which went beyond Sweden and found the same result. Lockdowns and masks had no measurable effect anywhere, but they caused horrific damage to our societies and to long-term health. So there you have it, folks. Pretty clear-cut case. If you stick to the scientific method and the principles of Karl Popper, you basically get the answers that are correct and reflect reality. So, as always, thanks so much to the people who support me on Patreon and PayPal donations, and the links are down below. And it's huge because we do need continued correct analysis of data. We need to share genuine inference and what it means and how reality is actually structured in our world. And sadly, the legacy media appear to be just pumping out, in many cases, nonsense, biased data based on advertisers and other incentives that they have, and we've lost them essentially. So it's great to see that there are still people out there willing to support correct analysis and true reflections, unbiased reflections on how our world works today. So thank you so much, guys.